Hello BookTube, welcome to Revenant Reads. I'm Ben, and this is another edition of Fresh Red Kills. So Fresh Red Kills is where I talk about my latest reads. So let's just get right into it. I did finish 2 books since the last time I made one of these videos. And please excuse the lighting. We got some direct sunlight coming in through the blinds. But I did finish reading The Poppy War by R.F. Kuang. And I believe that this is the first part of a trilogy. I believe the third one just recently came out. And this is a fantasy, grimdark fantasy. I've been wanting to read more fantasy. I hadn't read fantasy in so long. So I jumped at this when I saw that Steve, over at Steve Talks About Books and Stuff, was doing a read-along of it. So I just kind of took that as the opportunity to finally get my hands on this and read it. And I was especially intrigued by this because I was aware that the author, who I believe she was like 20 years old when this one was published, took inspiration from the Second Sino-Japanese War to create this. That was the war between Japan and China, led up right through World War II. And earlier this year, I had read Iris Chang's account of the rape of Nanking, which was certainly powerful, grim stuff. And I had heard that some of the reading here could be difficult, so I didn't know what to expect. Certainly I had read Chang's account of the rape of Nanking, and I didn't know if we were going to be taken through a fictionalized version of that in maybe excruciating detail. The way this was talked about, I was, I guess, expecting more than what I ended up getting. It's split up into 3 parts, and my feelings are mixed on this book. I know it's very popular and people really liked it, and I did like it overall. But the first part, it sometimes does feel a little bit more YA. It feels young with some of the dialogue, with some of what's going on. The first part kind of reminded me of like Harry Potter. We have this main character who she's an orphan, and she's brought up by these. I'm trying to remember if they're actually related. I don't think they are, but in a fairly by a fairly cruel adult, and she ends up getting into this prestigious school, and there's even this kind of aristocratic Draco Malfoy type character who bullies her, and you see where certain things are going. You know that the most eccentric people who you're introduced to are going to be the ones that are like the most profound and all-knowing, and we get that. We kind of get her going through her school days there, and then the second part is when the war happens, and this takes place in a fictionalized medieval fantasy version of China, and they're attacked by a fictionalized medieval fantasy version of Japan, and it's the references are pretty obvious. If you look at the map, you can very clearly see. We've got Japan, we got China. You see where it's all going. So the war starts. It breaks out in the second part, and then things get kind of progressively worse in the third part. I had mentioned, the rape of Nanking stuff comes in the third part. And it wasn't as bad as I thought it was going to be. They don't like take you through it in real time or anything like that. You're really just you're hearing this stuff secondhand from characters who witness certain things. So it's if you're not used to reading anything like that, then I can see where it would be very shocking. But if you've read the Rape of Nanking, it's not going to be shocking to you at all. I said some of the dialogue I had some kind of issues with. There's like little quips and one-liners they keep kind of zinging back and forth to each other that just kind of felt very. It makes it feel young the way that it's written. The main character, Rin, the second part, I should say, she kind of becomes bratty in a way that makes her almost unlikable. She's constantly complaining, and she becomes openly insubordinate to a level that completely surpasses credulity. Yeah, she would have been whipped or executed, I think, in any kind of real situation. But she's allowed to get away with too much, I think, compared to what other characters would get away with. And there are certain logical inconsistencies that I would find in here. At one point, there's a creature attacking a city that they're in. I think it's called a chime. Chime, that might be it. The enemy has like one side of a city, they're on the other, and there's like city people running for their lives, and they stop one person in the city and ask, and she's like, "Oh, a chime," and then they go on to say that the only reason that Rin knows what this is because she found it in like some obscure part of the archives when she was at school, and the other guy that she's with, who's also educated, doesn't even know what this thing is. And they talk about how these things haven't been seen for like hundreds of years, and they're very rare and obscure, and like nobody's ever defeated one or something. And I couldn't help but think, like, if they're so rare and obscure, how did that one random city dweller that they stopped know what this thing was? And when you see how they actually fight and defeat the thing, it doesn't really make sense, the kind of carnage that they ended up seeing, and how nobody seemed to have fought back. So anyway, there were just certain things that would happen with this where I'm like, okay, this isn't really connecting for me. And it distracted me. But I will say I enjoyed it overall. I see the parallels coming through. I think there's even a parallel that we're drawing on from the use of the atomic bomb at the end of this. But also, the more I start seeing the historical parallels, instead of being intrigued and wanting to keep reading, it kind of dampens my want to continue, because I feel like I already see the signposts ahead of where the author is going to try and go. And it reminds me of like when I read earlier this year, The Magician's Nephew, C.S. Lewis, and I said the Christian allegory kept getting away with the story because there were certain things he wanted to hit. And I can kind of see something like that potentially happening with this. Like I can already see like who's the Chiang Kai-shek character by the end of this. And is she going to be like a Chairman Mao type character? I don't know, but if she's paralleling history, then I kind of already see where things are going. And do I care enough to continue on the trilogy? I'm not entirely sure I do. There are some interesting side characters here, but I don't feel like they get enough of their own story arc and progression to make me want to dive in and see what happens to them. So I'm on the fence of whether or not I'm going to continue the series. I enjoyed this overall, but I'm not itching to go pick up the second one. So anyway, if you've read The Poppy War, I'd be interested to hear what your thoughts on it. There are certainly some very adult things that happen. We have things about drug abuse and everything else, but it was a strange contrast because sometimes this felt young to me. Then all of a sudden these adult things would be thrown in. So look forward to hearing other people's opinions. I know it's a very popular book. Another book that I finished, this is part of my maybemidrash, probably my weirdest choice. In that I made a video about that last week, what I was going to be reading for the religious themed readings for the month of May, where it takes religion seriously, or at least our discussion of religion should be serious. So this was a book that I had gotten out of a surprise book haul, not one that I would buy normally, but one that I'm curious about for certain reasons, and it did help to solidify certain ideas that I have. So this is The Haunted, One Family's Nightmare, the harrowing true story of demonic attack and intimidation by Robert Curran, with Jack and Janet Smurl and Ed and Lorraine Warren. Of course, The Conjuring 3 is coming out this year, about the devil in Connecticut, which happened right in my area. Some of the people involved in that live just a couple roads away from me. And I let it be known in my Maybe Midrash video that I am not a fan of the Warrens. I do not believe that they were honest at all. And I guess I should talk about a little bit that my attitude going into this, because I didn't go in with necessarily an open mind. We have there's a forward here from let me see if I can find it here. Yeah, from Bishop Robert McKenna. He's passed since then, from Monroe, Connecticut. And see if I can find where he says something. Sorry, I'm trying to remember where exactly this thing was. He essentially says that nobody who reads this with an open mind could come out still disbelieving. And it made me think of another. Oh yeah, those among us who do not believe in a higher power cannot read The Haunted with an open mind and come away still disbelieving. Um, I'm a pretty open-minded person, and I think it was Carl Sagan that said something like, "It's important to have an open mind, but not so open that your brains fall out." And this is a very interesting book. So, The Warrens. All right, I loved ghost stories growing up. I still do. And the Warrens were on my radar when I was young. Uh, when I was a kid and a young teen, they were still on the kind of lecture circuit where they would go around and present photos, and uh, it was always kind of a dream of mine to go and see them. And then I live in Connecticut, and so did they, just a few towns away. There was a cable access show with them. And I think it was maybe a relative of theirs that hosted it, where they basically sit on this mostly barren stage. Sometimes there's a couple of weird, like, tacky props. And they would talk about their cases. And at first it was like Amityville and stuff. And when I was a kid, I was really enraptured in this. And then the more episodes I watched, the more I began to lose, uh, my feelings of any kind of faith that I could put inside in Lorraine Warren. I remember there was a St. Patrick's Day episode where they're talking about elemental spirits and how fairies and gnomes are real, and Ed talks about going to Ireland and finding a little leprechaun hat there on St. Patrick's Day. And he claims, I think it's been a long time since I saw it, but I still remember certain things about it. He claims that the photo from 1917 of the girls who took the photos of the fairies, one that Arthur Conan Doyle kind of latched onto as proof of spiritualism, that we know for a fact were not real. He was still claiming in the mid 90s when this was published that those were real fairies inside that photo. And I started realizing there is nothing the Warrens will not believe. I'm sorry. Yeah, I don't know if I'm saying that right. There is nothing that they will refuse to believe in at any point. They're entirely credulous to things. And there were other ones about, like, of course, like helping a guy who was a werewolf, and it started deflating any sense that I had of the Warrens. And then the more and more I learned about them, the more I read about them, the more I kind of saw them as, I think that there was a mixture of genuine belief in them, but also a certain showman's, dishonesty, which I think was incredibly. There goes my dog. So I approached this with that attitude, certainly, of not knowing or believing the Warrens. So the reason that I chose this for Maybe Midrash was to look at the religious dimension to the kind of Warren-style hauntings. Certainly the Conjuring universe horror films have been very popular, very lucrative. As I mentioned, there's another one coming out this year. These are big budget events. And I think that the Warrens represent a certain brand, a religious brand of hauntings, which sounds like it would, obviously go together, but it's not. It doesn't actually happen that way. A lot of the haunting and ghost movies that have come around, at least in U.S. horror cinema, have been much more inspired by 19th century spiritualism, which was really it was a reaction to, in certain ways, a religious approach. It was trying to look at the afterlife and contact the dead more through the realms of science than through religion. It wasn't something that required faith. Right, it was more empirical evidence, something that was more tangible. And of course, now if you're a skeptic, that sort of thing sounds kind of ridiculous in certain ways. Maybe justly so. But that wasn't the intention of many spiritualists. There were many serious, scientifically minded individuals who took spiritualism very, very seriously. I already mentioned Arthur Conan Doyle. Okay, and they did it because it allowed them to explore possibilities of the afterlife outside the bounds of religion. And early filmmakers, when they started drawing upon their stories and putting ghosts in and that sort of thing, a lot of these guys, these early magicians, we're talking like Nickelodeon era, a lot of them were magicians, And magicians, such as somebody like Harry Houdini, they had often a very antagonistic relationship with spiritualists, often exposing them. A lot of American cinema was mocking of ghost belief. If there was a real ghost in a movie, it was generally comical. And if it was scary, then it was usually shown to be fake. And often spiritualists, psychics, mediums were often depicted as frauds. Um, Now, the Warrens do adopt some aspects of spiritualism, at least with Lorraine Warren being a sensitive, like a clairvoyant. But otherwise, the trappings of spiritualism, they end up seeing as invitations for demonic force. So something like a Ouija board, okay, which could be used in spiritualism, for them is a gateway to Satan. The hauntings that they encounter. Sometimes they're ghosts, but really more often they're demons. Um, and I guess it's one of the reasons why I'm not a big fan of the Conjuring films, especially, is because I don't really like the writing. Um, the Warrens generally don't have story arcs. They're just these too wholesome people. Um, and demons don't need motivation. They're just evil because they're demons. And, they just do bad things, and they just want to have people suffer. Which, yeah, maybe you can make some good set pieces in a horror film, but it makes for uninteresting scripting. And the Conjuring demons that we see, they're usually incredibly inconsistent with the powers that they have and that they can wield. And we see a similar thing here. We have a demon and other entities that are being controlled by the demon infesting the duplex of Jack and Janet Smurl. Jack's parents live on the other side of the duplex, and we have all sorts of your regular trappings of hauntings, stains that won't go away. So much of the American horror haunting story has to deal with houses kind of being a money trap, and there's this paranormal element where things are just constantly breaking on you and sucking up your money, and we do see some of that. But then it gets, this does have a surprising fixation with rape, with demons taking on the form of incubi and succubi, and trying to sexually assault, sometimes successfully, family members. This is okay. Just kind of get to the point with this part. Is it a good book? No. It's pretty ridiculous. The fact that it's being passed off as true is absurd. There's actually one part that had me laugh out loud. Just the bald-faced lies that could be inside one paragraph. This is when Father McKenna, who I'd read from his introduction before, when he's driving back from their house back to Connecticut, he says, on the drive back to Connecticut, enjoying the deep green spectacle of summer along Interstate 84, Father McKenna found himself thinking about an exorcism he participated in some years earlier and wondered why he hadn't thought of this before. In the Brenner case, this is the first time we ever hear the Brenner case, they don't explain anything about this, where it is, when it was, or anything like that. Excavation workers who'd been digging up a drainage ditch had found bones wrapped in decayed cloth buried deep in the ground. Father McKenna had a forensic expert examine the bones. I seriously doubt that would happen. The forensics man determined that they were pig bones, at least 800 years old. Immediately, Father McKenna knew why the Brenner's house was haunted. Part of its yard was the site of where pagan ritual had taken place more than 8 centuries earlier. No wonder demons infested the house. If you can read that with a straight face, there is so much wrong. Somebody is lying, if not everybody. The biggest thing is the fact that we have every intention of thinking that this is somewhere in the United States that this Brenner case happened. There were no pigs here 800 years ago. Not until Columbus and the Columbian Exchange that happened afterwards did pigs come into the New World. So if he had a forensics expert determine that there were 800-year-old pig bones inside an American's backyard, that would rewrite history in a huge, huge way. More than just a priest thinking about demons. So I mean, that's just a bold-faced lie that is occurring there. And then just the immediate, we find some pig bones and some old cloth, pagan sacrifice, of course. What other explanation could there possibly be? These are the sorts of things that are in this book that I don't think you have to be much of a skeptic to realize are just patently ridiculous. Uh, and, so if we get back to the religious aspect, hardly a page goes by that religion isn't mentioned somehow. Whether it be them talking about what an amazing, wonderful Catholic family the Smurls were, and how when they were younger, this was published in the late '80s. When they were younger, they weren't like the hippies. They're very wholesome Americans. At one point, Jack falls asleep reading a book, and of course, that book is a biography of John Wayne. What else would a red-blooded American Catholic male in the late 1980s be allowed to be reading? I guess that of course I'm sure is Curran's choice in the matter. But yeah, Pages. It's always about faith. It's always about Catholicism, about God, and of course when Lorraine come in, they perform exorcisms that are heavily dripping with religion. So, I mean, what the reason I'm glad, sorry, I'm trying to get my words out here, that I read this book is because it did help me solidify this feeling that I was having. And it's something that I want to investigate further, as the Warrens being, in many ways, a reaction to spiritualism. The legacy, at least, of spiritualism in the way that ghosts have been approached in a more of a scientific way and trying to take religion out of it. They seem like they are a reaction to bringing spiritual warfare into hauntings, into what is really kind of more the realm of horror. I mean, that's what this is. This is spiritual warfare. It's people against demonic forces. And here, instead, it's played out inside people's homes. And, I do still want to go back and see the TV movie that was made of this, right around 1990 or so. Because I remember liking it as a kid. I don't know what I'll think of it today. But yeah, okay. Would I recommend this? No, not one bit. Definitely not. There was one creepy thing that happened. They do talk about how at one point they're like watching TV, and a puppy runs in that doesn't have a head or a tail, and it runs across the room and disappears into a crack in the furniture. That's just such a bizarre image that I appreciated now having that in my mind to draw upon. There are so many times in this book where they're like in bed falling asleep and something will happen, and you can chalk so much up to sleep paralysis. And if you really have to try and look for logical explanations and not just the fact that this is probably a hoax. But anyway, I'm not here to try and psychologically dissect the Smurls or anything like that. But this is my channel, my reaction to the book, and that's what these episodes are all about. Fresh Red Kills. It's what I'm thinking. These are my honest reactions. So no, I didn't like the book, but I am glad that I read it, and it gives me more insight into, I think, how hauntings have been playing out in certain segments of the American populace inside their imagination in that religious dimension. So it's one I have to give more thought to. But anyhow, the last thing I started reading, I'm not going to talk much about it. I did pick up The Dark Knight Returns, which Matt at Mayberry Book Club, Steve Donoghue, they are hosting a read-along, and also Michael K. Vaughn has also started making videos about it, and I recommend all those. Their videos are terrific, honestly, talking about this. This is Frank Miller's The Dark Knight Returns, I think published in 1986, that really revolutionized Batman and also comics in general, along with The Watchmen, making them much darker, much grittier. And I became a comic fan in the wake of this. So I didn't grow up with the more sanitized version of Batman. I became a comic fan in the 90s. I remember my parents had got me, I guess they got like a package of different comics or something. It must have been like little kid type comics, but there was one Batman, and I must have been in maybe 5th or 6th grade. And I finally, they had been sitting in my room for a long time, and I'm like, oh, let me just read this and see what this is like. And I loved it. So Batman was what got me into comics. And I spent most of my middle school reading and drawing comics, my middle school years. And I just remember after reading that Batman comic, I went up to Maine from Connecticut with my grandparents, and I was in the back seat, and all I was doing was drawing my own comic characters. So I know I had read parts of this at least in the 90s, but I didn't recognize it for the revolutionary thing that it was. I just was used to comics being dark, so I didn't know that this was anything different. Reading it now, I'm not gonna go rehashing everything that people have said already. I think that those videos I mentioned earlier really hit the nail on the head with it. This is a morally questionable Batman in a morally questionable book. It's hard to see what Frank Miller is doing sometimes. He does have some really good artwork sometimes, stunning images of Batman. But this is a Batman who's older, who's trying to prove to himself that he's still got it. But he does, I mentioned this on Michael K. Vaughn's video, I commented, this is like if Canon Films had made a Batman movie in the 80s after Miller had watched way too much Death Wish and Delta Force and, just people, criminals being destroyed with extreme prejudice and the most ridiculous criminals that you could possibly imagine that would totally feel at home inside an 80s movie like some of the Death Wishes and, those kinds of movies, those kind of cheap, corny action movies. And Batman, he does kind of become less and less recognizable as Batman. He is kind of this this police state enforcer, it seems, as it goes. At one point, we see this really souped up tank of a Batmobile, and yeah, here it is. I mean, it is just all kinds of chaos going on. But he mentions that he had modified it because of some riots from like 15 years earlier. And all I could think is, okay, this is 1986, and Miller is kind of still keeping this like as though like Batman was getting old from when he first appeared. If this is a world that's somehow comparable to ours, 15 years ago riots, are we talking like race riots and Vietnam protests? What side was Batman on during that? Was he enforcing the state, or was he, actually seeking out some justice? And the way that he's written in this, I am not entirely sure. I don't know exactly what Batman was doing with this. So yeah, Batman, he's not terribly wise. He makes a lot of impulsive, kind of foolish decisions in this. I'm halfway through. I've read the first 2 parts out of 4 parts, and I am enjoying it. I'm enjoying it as a book, but I agree with a lot of what the other guys have said, that this is not necessarily Batman. And there are some issues with the writing. Some really good writing, but also some really questionable. So anyway, I'll kind of give my final impressions when I finish the next 2 parts. I just want to mention that I am doing that read-along as well. So yeah, in terms of what I finished this week, I've got The Haunted and The Poppy War. And this is a long video, a lot of ranting, but if you stuck by this long, thanks. All right, thank you, BookTube.